We work, we live, we innovate and create. At the center of it all is your brain health. The ability to solve problems, think analytically, share empathy, and thrive.
We're trying to make brain performance really the next fitness revolution.
So how do you boost brain power? Welcome to the BrainHealth Project, an urgent call to transform your mind to work stronger and faster.
This is an absolute crisis as great as any we have ever faced. We have to equip the minds and brains of our citizens to cope with the accelerating, dizzying rate of change that they face in their lives.
Your brain health is not fixed. Scientific discoveries prove it can adapt and grow regardless of your starting point.
Our greatest value, the asset that will help us to change everything, every problem we're in, is all in our head.
To harness that treasure, we must measure and monitor progress while things are going well versus waiting for an injury or disease to strike.
Too many of us are outliving our brains, and that does not have to be the case.
The information age is bombarding us with more content than our human brains can handle. How do you keep from getting lost in this? And focus on deep thinking. For starters, stop multitasking.
Science shows us that multitasking is bad for your brain. It reduces fluid intelligence, causes brain atrophy, and increases chronic stress.
The global pandemic is creating more stress than ever, stress that leads to depression and anxiety and beyond. Unlocking our potential to navigate these hurdles starts with learning the right strategies, even in school.
So when teachers have these strategies, they're empowered to support our learners, and then the learners are now able to take ownership of their learning.
Training kids how to think is doubling academic achievement among middle schoolers.
I think the greatest national security threat is pre-K through 12. If we don't take care of educating our young men and women, then we have to ask ourselves, where are we going to be in 20 years?
Our world-renowned scientists know you can increase your brain health, not lose it. It's time for a new category of health, brain health. You are a game changer. Ready to transform the world with us? Be a part of the brain health revolution. It starts here.
Good evening. Hello. I just want to welcome everyone tonight. This is going to be one of our most exciting events. It's something we wait for all year. It's our biggest event of the year, the Brain and Owner's Guide. This is the first year in 20 years that we haven't met in person. But oh man, you're in for a real treat. Typically we reach 500 people. We had over 15,000 people from around the world sign up for this. So we're so excited. My name is Dr. Sandra Bond Chapman. I'm the founder and chief director of the Center for Brain Health. I love that people are so hungry about finding out what is it that I can do to take care of my brain. As a cognitive neuroscientist and a professor at the University of Texas at Dallas, I have dedicated the past 3 decades to discovering and championing an entirely new category of health, brain health. In fact, 2 decades ago, we got a trademark on it because the word didn't even exist. Not only are we advancing discoveries in brain health, but we are very rapidly translating those because we're impatient. We want every one of you to know, what can you do today to make your brain stronger, work faster, and last longer? Hosting events like this today to get our message out, always based in fact-based hope and optimism. We have now launched, and I'm so excited about it, a whole technology platform that will allow people everywhere to be proactive, getting a brain health index, learning trainings, so that you can become part of the Brain Health Project from ages 10 to 100. Don't you want your best brain years to be ahead of you? That's really what we're all about. As you listen to our amazing speaker tonight, I want you to begin to imagine how much untapped potential do you have because of the things that you're doing, that you could unlock some of it by taking charge of your brain health tonight. I want to welcome all of you, and also to let you know that we are going to have question and answers at the end of this. Type your questions in the Q&A and they'll be monitored, and we will try to get to as many as possible. And I know there's going to be a lot because so many of us have questions, and we have one of the world's experts with us tonight. Tonight would not be possible without our generous evening sponsors. It's sponsored by the Gratitude Fund. And those sponsors, Samara, if you turn on your camera, and Andy McCarthy, you have been with us and sponsoring us for so many years because this means something to you. I would love for you all to just, in your hearts and spirits, thank Samara for believing in this, and Andy Klein, the Gratitude Fund. We're so grateful to you, Samara. Thank you. Now, it's my privilege to introduce our speaker, Dr. Lisa Mosconi. Dr. Mosconi is a neuroscientist and a neuronutritionist who's dedicated her research to understanding this whole intersection of neuroscience and women's health. She's focused on things like our genetics, our environment, lifestyle that can literally shape our brain over the lifespan. She is funded by Maria Shriver's The Women's Alzheimer's Movement. And I want to tell you, Maria is very tough to sponsor because she has high expectations. So it is the good housekeeping stamp of approval. Lisa wants efforts to help women protect their brain from dementia, to keep it at the highest level of capacity. She also wants us to think about the caregivers who are also at risk because of all this stress in terms of what they're dealing with to lose capacity. As director of the Weill Cornell Women's Brain Initiative, Dr. Lisa Mosconi's team looks at precision therapies to prevent, to delay, and to treat Alzheimer's disease. She is a New York Times bestseller, author of Brain Food, and most recently, if you don't have it now, the XX Brain, you will want to order it as soon as this is over. This is one of the most transformative books with cutting edge information. So be sure to get your book. And how Lisa had time to be with us tonight, I was thinking that if we had invited her, Lisa, go ahead and open your camera because I'd love to talk to you. If we had had her, hi Lisa, if we had you come, you might not have made it because of your snow. Tell us about the snow and your family.
Well, we got about 16 inches of snow, so we're technically snowbound, and you know, I'm not a winter person. I have to say, I'm from Italy. As you know, I'm from Florence, and I'm all for summer. I just can't wait for the sun to be back and the snow to go. But
well, we need to have you come back down here. I'm going to go away and welcome you. Lisa, take over.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me, Sandy. I'm just really happy to be here tonight and to have a chance to talk about our work on women's brain health. So I'm going to share my screen first and my slides next. And I hope you can see them okay. Okay, wonderful. So again, really, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's such a privilege and an honor to be able to connect with so many people here tonight. I'm really, really excited about it. And tonight, I'm going to talk about a topic that is very dear to my heart and is really the focus of my research, and that is women's brains. So like you mentioned, Sandy, my background is in neuroscience and nuclear medicine, which is a branch of radiology, which means that I've been doing a lot of brain imaging work, and I will show you some brain scans today. But the thing is, I now work at the intersection between neuroscience, neurology, radiology, and women's health, which is quite an unusual space to be in. It's a very interesting space. It's a very challenging space in so many ways. And my research is focused on really understanding how sex and gender impact brain aging and risk of neurological disorders like Alzheimer's disease. So as I mentioned, I am a brain scientist by training. I'm a neuroscientist, and I'm very invested in women's health overall, but primarily in women's brain health. Now, there are many theories on how women's brains differ from men's brains, since I do get a lot of Mars and Venus type questions, but my work is focused on the raw biological differences between the female brain and the male brain, because these differences are real and they're very important for our health overall. So for context, women are twice as likely as men to be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder and depression. We are 3 times more likely to develop an autoimmune disorder, including those that attack the brain, like multiple sclerosis. We're 4 times more likely to really suffer from headaches and migraines, as any woman can say, right? Any woman can say that. But we're also more likely to develop meningiomas, which are the most common forms of brain tumors, and we're far more likely to die of a stroke. And on top of all this, women are more likely than men to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is the most common form and cause of dementia on the planet, affecting almost 6 million people in the United States alone, and over 30 million patients globally. And we've all heard the statistics one way or the other, but what I hope that we'll start hearing more and more often is that almost 2/3 of all those patients are actually women. So for every man suffering from Alzheimer's disease, there are 2 women. And we've known this since the 90s, that after aging itself, after getting older, female sex, or simply being born a woman, is the strongest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease in the population. And something else that we don't talk about enough is that risk might be even higher for women of color, especially Black women and Hispanic women. So clearly there's so much work that needs to be done. And the main question for me has always been why? Why is that overall? Is it age? Is it lifespan? Is it that women live longer? What other factors could contribute to the higher prevalence of Alzheimer's disease in women, as well as of all those other conditions? Right? It's really an open question. And so a few years ago, I launched the Women's Brain Initiative at Wildcat Medicine in New York City, exactly to answer these questions. And I'm really proud that the Women's Brain Initiative is a research program entirely dedicated to women's brain health, unapologetically so, I would add. And we're really focused on understanding how brain health plays out differently in women than in men. I started out, it was just me and my research assistant, Anila Rachman, and you'll see some of her work tonight. And we're now over 35 people strong, and we're blessed with so many collaborators. And really there's strength in numbers, because together we were able to come up with some answers, which I'm going to share, of course, tonight. But before we talk about the answers, I really want to clarify something that is so important and so commonly overlooked, which is that women have not been studied, in spite of the fact that women make up the majority of patients with Alzheimer's disease, anxiety, depression, and whatnot. Most of the research simply ignores gender differences. And one of my earliest questions has always been like, why? Why is that? How did that happen? A few things happened that I really want to share tonight, because I think it's important to know the history, right? It's important to know how we got to where we are. And there's this one defining moment back in the 60s when a drug called thalidomide, which many of you probably know about, was given to pregnant women to relieve nausea. But it turned out that the drug was not safe for the children, many of whom were born with quite severe physical and health issues. So then the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, decided to, number one, ban the drug, of course, but also they decided to exclude all women of childbearing potential, which is any woman from puberty through menopause, from early drug studies. But then this cautionary approach ended up being applied to all clinical trials, really across the board, to the result that for a really long time, research was done only on men. Years later, the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, came to the rescue, and they made it a requirement that women be reconsidered for inclusion in research. And the FDA did not mandate inclusion, but they lifted the restriction. The female ban was restricted in 1993 so that women could be once again enrolled in clinical studies. So fast forward to today, enrollment has increased, but the vast majority of studies still do not look at gender. They have the information, they collect the information, but they don't use it. So for many years, we had all this research with no women in it, and now they were required by law to enroll women in research. Most studies just lump men and women together, and then they use statistical procedures to remove the effects of gender, which is the same as saying that women are the same as men. Effectively, this is what research claims in a way. And to be clear, this is a big issue. It's a big issue that only reinforces this essential misunderstanding of what women are to start with. So historically, I do like history, medical professionals believed that women were essentially smaller men with different reproductive organs, those parts of the body that would fit under a bikini, which I refer to as bikini medicine. Now, bikini medicine is saying that from a medical perspective, what makes a woman is a reproductive system, right? And given this framework, the very concept of women's health is problematic because research and care are confined to our reproductive organs. And I think it's obvious that our brains just do not fit under a bikini, which means that women's brain health is still today one of the most under-researched, underdiagnosed, undertreated, and I'm going to add underfunded fields of medicine. So basically, this is why I launched the Women's Brain Initiative. And their goals today are to, number one, convince other scientists and the government that gender matters, which I think is a big step forward. And number two, to really move research forward by looking at genetic, hormonal, and physiological differences between the genders that translate into potentially different pathways to brain aging and dementia. And this is important to do because as soon as we started looking, we immediately found evidence that risk of Alzheimer's disease actually varies by gender. It does matter if you're a man or a woman. And we and others have identified over 30 risk factors for Alzheimer's that increase risk more in women than in men, or only in women and not in men. And some of those risks are summarized here. So as I mentioned, just being a woman having a double X chromosome is a major risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. But also there's a genetic factor that is called the ApoE or apolipoprotein E4 gene that doubles the risk of Alzheimer's disease in women compared to men. And then we have some medical factors that increase risk more in women, like some forms of cardiovascular disease and even depression in midlife. And of course, then we have menopause, which is a female-specific risk, and I'm going to talk about menopause more in just a minute. But also, we have some lifestyle factors that increase risk more in women, including a lack of exercise, a poor diet, and too much stress. So I'm going to start with menopause. And nobody ever talks about menopause as something that can affect the brain. So I think it's really important that research is looking into that right now. The reason being that from a neurological perspective, a big difference between the genders is that their brains age differently. And menopause plays a key role here for women. Now, we tend to think about our brains as being isolated from the rest of the body, but in reality, our brains are in constant interaction with the rest of us. And the interactions between the brain and the reproductive system are really crucial for brain aging in women. And these interactions are mediated by our hormones. And I think we all know that hormones differ somewhat between the genders. Right, so men have more androgens, like testosterone, and women have more estrogens. But what's really important here, what's really important for our brain health is that these hormones differ in their lifespan, in their trajectory, and in their longevity. Men's testosterone doesn't really run out until late in life, which is a slow and fairly gradual, almost linear process. But women's estrogens, on the other hand, start fading in midlife during menopause, which is anything but gentle or gradual, as any woman can attest to for sure. Now, as a society, we associate menopause with the ovaries, right? But when women say that they're having hot flashes, night sweats, insomnia, anxiety, depression, brain fog, memory lapses, those symptoms don't start in the ovaries. They start here, in the brain. Those are neurological symptoms. We're just not used to thinking about them as such, right? So these are the brain symptoms of menopause that are experienced by over 80% of all women on this planet. And they start in the brain. So why is that? Big question at the very beginning of my studies. Why are our brains impacted by menopause? There are a few reasons. First of all, our brains and ovaries are part of the neuroendocrine system, which is a system where the ovaries talk to the brain and the brain talks back to the ovaries every day of our lives as women. So really, the health of the ovaries is linked to the health of the brain and the other way around. And that's a big connection that we very often overlook. And very often nobody even knows about it, really, to be clear. Now, the other reason is that hormones like estrogen are not only involved in fertility and reproduction, but also in brain function. And estrogen in particular, or estradiol, which is the most potent form of estrogen, the one that we lose during menopause, is considered the master regulator of the female brain. Estradiol regulates immunity, giving resilience and strength to the brain. It really supports neuroplasticity, which is like it supports the growth of new synapses and new neurons and connections between different parts of the brain. And also, it's key for energy production in the brain. So at the cellular level, estrogen literally pushes neurons to burn more glucose to make more energy, which means that when estrogen is high, your brain energy is high. But when estrogen declines during menopause, our neurons slow down and start aging faster. And some studies have shown that this process can, in turn, promote the formation of amyloid beta plaques or Alzheimer's plaques, which are a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. Now, something that is really interesting, I believe, is that these effects are stronger in specific brain regions, including very importantly, a region that we never really talk about, which is the hypothalamus, which is in charge of regulating body temperature. So if estrogen doesn't regulate the hypothalamus correctly, the brain cannot regulate body temperature correctly. So those hot flashes that women have, that's the hypothalamus not working correctly because estrogen is no longer there to make it work enough. Or there's the brainstem in charge of sleep and wake. When estrogen doesn't activate the brainstem correctly, we have trouble sleeping. And then you put the two together and you get night sweats, right? Or it's the amygdala, the emotional center of the brain, close to the hippocampus, the memory center of the brain. When estrogen's levels ebb in these regions, we can get mood swings or start forgetting things. It's a whole system that is impacted by estrogen loss. And this is really the brain anatomy of menopause, if you will. But let me show you what an actual woman's brain looks like. And this is where brain imaging comes in handy. So this is what I do for a living. I've been doing brain scans ever since I was like 20 years old, or perhaps even before then. And this is a positron emission tomography scan, or PET for sure, that looks at brain energy levels. And this is what you want your brain to look like when you're 43 years old. It's the way I want my brain to look like for sure. Very nice and bright with a lot of bright colors that signal high brain energy levels. Now, this brain belongs to a woman who was 43 years old when she came to work with us for the first time. And this is a very healthy looking brain. And she was premenopausal at the time. That was right before menopause. And this is the same brain just 8 years later after she went through menopause. And I think if we put them side by side, obviously they're scaled the same way. I think it's really clear how the bright yellow, almost white, turned orange and purple, right? It's a clear change, I think, that we can see. And this is quantitatively, it's a 20% drop in brain energy levels in just 8 years or less. And to be clear, this is average. This is not just this one woman, and I'll show you the data in just a minute. This is something that happens very, very frequently. But also, generally speaking, this just doesn't seem to happen to a man of the same age. So we started with a small data set because everybody thought that was nuts when I was looking into this. But now we have hundreds of participants in the studies, and we were able to really, really better understand what's happening. So when we look at hundreds of middle-aged men and women, the men typically have high brain energy levels, which is wonderful, and that's the way it should be. And for women, brain energy is just as high before menopause, but then it tends to decline. And this was found independent of age. It didn't matter if the women were 40, 50, or 60. What mattered most was that they were going through menopause. And we need more research to confirm this. We're working as hard as we can. But the bottom line is that women's brain in midlife are very sensitive to hormonal aging, even more so than just chronological aging. And we need to talk about this because so many women are aware of these changes. They're aware that something is happening to their brains, and they really want to reassure everybody that we're not going crazy. There's a transition. Our brains are adjusting. We need to understand what's happening so that we can address it. And also, if anyone is concerned that middle-aged women might be underperformers, I want to reassure everybody that it's exactly the opposite. We look at cognitive performance all the time, and there really are no differences between men and women before and after menopause. And other studies confirm this. Women actually tend to outperform men at any age on cognitive testing. And I'm not just being, too much of a feminist. This is actual data. When you do cognitive testing, women tend to perform incredibly well, even after they develop Alzheimer's disease. So we're looking into that and what kind of compensatory mechanisms might be at play, because I think it's really important that we support those mechanisms, right? But that said, there's something else that deserves our attention that is less good news in a way. So I said before that estrogen changes could potentially promote the formation of Alzheimer's plaques. And there's another tracer that we can use. There's another type of brain scan that looks specifically at those plaques, the Alzheimer's plaques. And we used it to show that middle-aged men don't really have any plaques, which again is fantastic news if you're a man. But for women, we found that there's quite a bit of an increase during the transition to menopause. And I want to be super clear here that not all women develop these plaques, and not all women with the plaques develop dementia. Having the plaques is a risk factor. It is in no way a diagnosis, but it is a red flag. It's something that we need to know and something that we need to address. And I think it's really important that we do, because we have established a firm link between Alzheimer's disease and menopause, which is somewhat foreign, is somewhat counterintuitive. We think of menopause as middle age and Alzheimer's disease as old age. But in reality, many studies, including a ton of my own work, have really shown that Alzheimer's disease starts with negative changes in the brain years, if not decades, prior to clinical symptoms. And our studies have shown that for women, this process starts around menopause, which really changes and really shifts the timeline dramatically to midlife, to middle age. And we need to start looking for those changes and talk about Alzheimer's prevention, not only in our 70s and 80s and later than that, but also in our 40s and 50s. I think this is very empowering information if we think about it that way. It's a little scary, but it's also really important to have. The timeline is really important, because most women go through menopause in their early 50s. The median age in the United States is 52. But it can be earlier, sometimes due to genetics, more often due to medical interventions. A very common example is a hysterectomy and or an oophorectomy, which is the surgical removal of the uterus and or the ovaries. And unfortunately, there is evidence that having the uterus and more so the ovaries removed before menopause correlates with a higher risk of dementia in women. And this is something that very few people working in women's health, OBGYNs, menopause specialists, there are very few who actually are aware of this correlation. So we're really trying to open up a conversation there so that we can all be aware and address the risks together. And to be clear, no one is suggesting that women should decline the procedures if they need them. Right? I am a big advocate of prevention in every way, shape, or form. But the point is that we need to better understand what happens to our brains as we go through menopause and how to protect them in the process, right? And fortunately, and finally, some good news, there are many things that we can do to protect our brains and our hormones effects on our brains. So for some women, this is the question everybody asks. Should we take hormones? And this is such a good question, such a reasonable question. And for some women, taking hormones might be a good strategy. We can talk about this more in the Q&A if you like, but I just want to mention that hormonal replacement therapy can be helpful to alleviate a number of symptoms like hot flashes, although it's not currently recommended for dementia prevention. And needless to say, we're looking into this right now. So many people are looking into it right now. But there are also other things that we can do that do not require medications, but do require taking a good look at our lifestyle. Because as I mentioned before, the foods that we eat, how often we exercise, how much stress we have in our lives, how little we sleep, how sleep deprived we all are, all these things really matter. And I'm very interested in food, so I'm going to start with that. And I want to say that there are many diets out there. Everybody's on a diet, but many studies have shown that the Mediterranean diet is particularly supportive of women's health. So women on this diet pattern, if you will, have a lower risk of pretty much everything they were trying to prevent. They have a lower risk of cognitive decline, of depression, of heart disease, of stroke, of cancer, and they also have fewer hot flashes. What's interesting about this diet, it is quite rich in foods that contain estrogens in the form of phytoestrogens or estrogens from plants that once they're ingested, they act like mild estrogens in our bodies. And the phytoestrogens in the Mediterranean style diet are perfectly safe. They're from foods like flax seeds, sesame seeds, dried apricots that are a really good source, dried figs, all sorts of legumes, beans, chickpeas are very good sources. Whole grains are also good sources. And fruit, like berries, especially strawberries, that are good source, and also tropical fruits like mango, papaya, pineapple, and melon. Yeah, so it's actually a really good diet. It's a good diet. It's yummy. I'm Italian, so I'm a little bit biased, but this is actual research. So diet is one way to gain estrogens, which may or may not work for everyone, but it does work for a lot of women. But also it's just as important to avoid things that suppress estrogens instead, especially stress. So stress literally steals your estrogens because cortisol, which is the main stress hormone, works in balance with your estrogens. So if your cortisol goes up, your estrogens go down. If you're able to reduce stress and cortisol declines, then estrogen production can resume. So really, reducing stress doesn't just help your day, it also helps your brain. And that's important, especially during a pandemic where everybody's stress levels are off the charts for sure. Last but not least, exercise. Exercise is a boost for your hormones and your brain at the same time. And there's really interesting new research showing that women's brains might benefit from exercise, perhaps even more than men's brains. There are these new studies showing that women who are physically active in midlife tolerate menopause much better, but most importantly, I think, have a 30% lower risk of future dementia as compared to women who are sedentary. Now, if I had a drug that reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease by 30%, I would be rich and everybody would buy it. Instead, the prescription is simply to keep moving. Also eat healthily, sleep more if you can, relax, and just take care of yourself from the outside and from the inside as best you can, because all these things really, really matter for prevention. And I know that these are just a few things that we can do, but perhaps the most important thing right now is that changing the way that we understand the female brain really changes the way that we care for it, and also changes the way that we frame women's health. I strongly believe that the sooner we start looking at gender and reproductive health as being important for our brains, the sooner we'll come out with solutions that actually work, not just for Alzheimer's disease, but for women's brain health as a whole. And I'm going to stop here, and I just want to let everybody know that there are some resources that I wanted to share. If anybody is interested in reading more on that research or women's brains, I actually wrote a book about it. It's right there with a beautiful intro by Maria Shriver. Thank you for mentioning that before. And if you're interested in participating in our research, this is our contact information. And thank you so much again for having me. I'm going to stop here and probably also stop sharing my screen if I find my mouse.
Lisa, oh my word, that was so amazing. Everyone was like, wow, how'd you get her? What? Oh my gosh. So they want to see it again, but you also need to read the book. And now, husbands, don't buy it for your wives as an insult, right? Do it as a I know of what's happening, but wow, so much knowledge, and so many questions have been coming in. What I'm curious about is, what I said at the outset, that we're launching this brain health project
Yes.
to enroll 120,000 healthy people and follow them over at least 10 years to show that every year their brain can be as good as it was the year before or better. So if you were to start collaborating with us, what measures would you want us to monitor as part of this to say this is what you need to look at? And then what two things would you say might be some interventions?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm very happy to share my protocols with you if you would like. We started a certain way, and then we really fine-tuned the questionnaires that we use, the labs that we collect, the evaluations that we do, all based on the research. What the research was showing that was really most important. So at some point we dropped certain things and added others. And for me, well, I would love for you to do brain scans, and I'm very happy to share all the sequences.
Yes, we will be.
Great. So I have a lot of information on this because we started doing some like for MRI, we're doing some sequences that seem to be really, really sensitive to female brain aging. Like we're measuring mitochondrial activity using MRI, which is not invasive. So I have a lot to share. I'm very happy to do that. And it was strongly recommended that you include some kind of, menopause questionnaires, menopause assessments, obviously a strong medical history, and that's obvious. And also some cognitive tests that seem to be much more sensitive to estrogen declines, especially in midlife, because the tests that we do normally, they're too easy. They're just too easy for people who are cognitively healthy, especially women, because our verbal memory is just good. It's just good at any age. You just can't use those tests are too simple. So I would be happy to share some tests that seem to be more sensitive. And then reproductive health questionnaires. We're looking at so many different variables that signal estrogen exposure, endogenous and exogenous, and we're getting a really strong signal. Actually, I have a paper for you. I'll have, hopefully, a paper for you to read soon.
Oh, good. Fantastic. Well, we're very interested in that. Another big question I have is, I'm curious, have you had genetic testing? And would you recommend young women get it if they have it in the family? And what would you have them do once they find out, if they're in their 20s and 30s, for the ApoE4? Say, I'm curious. I always love to ask scientists, did you do it? And
I did not.
Recommend people do it? You have not.
I have not. I have never done genetic testing on myself. I think the problem with genetic testing is, what are we testing for? So there are two different forms of Alzheimer's disease. There's an early onset familial form that the vast majority of cases is caused by genetic mutations. And then there's the very common late onset form that is found in like 98% of all Alzheimer's patients, where there are no specific genetic mutations involved. It's a multifactorial disease with a genetic background, like the ApoE4 genotype, but also so many other things are just as important as the ApoE4. And I think it's really personality based. Like, a lot of people find out their ApoE status and panic, just panic. Number one, I really resent the media in a way for blowing up this ApoE4 thing, because it's now being branded as the Alzheimer's gene, which is absolutely not. The Alzheimer's gene is a genetic mutation that causes disease. It's not a risk factor that increases risk by X amount. So that information is only valuable if you're working with a person who can manage your risk. And I have tests in the book, because this comes up all the time, understandably so, right? Of course, it's everybody's major concern. So how do you know if genetic testing is even useful to you or not. So I have that in the book. And then the recommendations are the same. These are things that you should do anyway. You should just do them more aggressively.
Yeah.
But pretty much all we can do at this point is really focus on prevention. So if you're an ApoE4 carrier, you need to do certain things even more aggressively. You need to be more determined. You have to push yourself more. But do you want to know? Because that is a motivational factor for you. If the answer is yes, by all means, get tested. If the answer is that you're going to get depressed and worry about your health and just not enjoy your life because of this knowledge, perhaps not. I think it's very case by case. And I always, always, always recommend to work with a genetic counselor. That is incredibly important. We don't do it anymore because we have 23andMe, which is not even that accurate, I'm told.
No.
Right? It's just not that accurate.
Yeah.
It mistakes BRCA mutations in 50% of the cases. It just came out, it came out in Nature that the false positive rate was huge.
Yes.
So if you want to get tested, work with a physician who really understands genetics. Have a genetic counselor there to really explain all the ins and outs of genetics, which is very, very complicated. And also make sure it's the right thing for you to do. Do not take it lightly.
Yeah.
That is my major recommendation. And really work on prevention regardless.
I love what you said, Lisa. I so agree. Absolutely. We want people to be proactive, but the things that can take away and increase the stress, like what you were talking about. So obviously there's a lot of questions about hormone therapy for women.
Yes.
And so again, you addressed it a little bit, but could hormone therapy for women in menopause and postmenopause reduce the potential for Alzheimer's plaque formation?
We don't know for sure. So this is something I've been struggling for a little while, because you would think that the research had been done, right? And there are clinical trials of hormonal replacement therapy that, number one, did not use brain imaging. They just looked at cognitive performance, cognitive testing, and decline rates to dementia. And what I think I'm going to summarize a really, really complex field in like 1 minute, which is simplistic. But the thing is, for women who are more than 6 years post-menopause, starting hormonal therapy then is not helpful. It can actually increase risk of cognitive decline. For women who are within 6 years of menopause, on average, there is no benefit on cognition. In my opinion, and this is just my own personal opinion, we need to start prior. You might want to start before menopause, or as close as possible to menopause, and see what happens, and use brain scans to really see the effects of therapy on the brain. So I think that a lot more work is needed. Right now, I'm just really going to defer to the authority in this field, which is the North American Menopause Society. They do not currently recommend hormonal therapy for dementia prevention. I think they have very good reasons to say so. They do say, and a lot of people agree, that if you have a hysterectomy, and especially an oophorectomy before menopause, then hormonal therapy might really reduce the risk. So there's this big difference, right, that is based on age, how old you are, and how far away from menopause you are, and whether or not you are experiencing surgical menopause. And the indications really differ based on that, and also based on a huge variety of factors, from cardiovascular risks, cancer risks, diabetes risks. So every woman is different. I think what you said at the beginning of this talk, that we're trying to use a precision medicine approach, right? This is so true in women's health. We need a precision medicine approach. You are different from me. I'm different from my friend. We're all, yes, we're women, But that doesn't mean that what works for you will work for me. We really need to understand female physiology and start thinking about the individual in front of us. And I'm hoping that the research will help, because we're introducing all these different variables that nobody has really used before. So the field, I mean, not just us, I don't want to, as scientists, we're really doing a lot of work to make it better.
Yeah, so important. I couldn't agree more. It's so confusing when, remember, I don't know if you were doing research back when they thought estrogen was protective, and they started taking it. So what would you say for that? They were giving men different types of female hormones.
But at some point, hormones were all the rage, right? As soon
Yes.
as they became available, it was like a trend.
Yes.
Everybody just jumped on it. Everybody was so relieved. Oh my goodness, let's just give them hormones so they don't suffer. And that's great. I think it's the right approach. What bothers me a little bit is that women got put on hormones at very high doses years after menopause, before clinical trials were even done. So clinical practice went way ahead of the research, and then we had to really take a huge step back when the research caught up and said, wait a minute, we're not doing this right. We have to rethink it. And then, of course, everybody stopped taking hormones, and the lawsuits were enormous. Pharmaceutical companies got really scared, and research stopped. So now there's been a little bit of a revival.
Yes.
Hormonal therapy, and more people are really thinking, well, let me start earlier. Let me look at different risk factors. Let me look at things that could really help or not help. And let's look at women as actual beings, right? With a life, and the body and the brain. And let's see what we can do for them.
Well, and I love how you point out, the cardio, heart health is so different from men and women, and yet that's been stuck. So someone's asked about how are women's brains affected by pregnancy and motherhood long term?
Oh, I love it. This is such a wonderful emerging field, and we've been doing research on that too. We're going to start doing research on that very soon. So there are some really beautiful studies that looked at women's brains before pregnancy, right after the baby was born, and 2 years later. And what they have shown, which I think is so fascinating, is that completely contrary to all expectations, women's brains shrink during pregnancy. Our brains lose volume. And it looks like, I know this sounds like bad news, but it's not. I'm going to tell you why. I'm just like, what? Just a second. So brain volumes kind of get smaller during pregnancy, and especially after the baby is born. But then they kind of regrow, and they almost go back to normal 2 years postpartum, which really correlates for most women when you finally come up for air. It's true. So I could not believe when my friends were like, oh, I'm having a baby, I'm feeling this baby brain, I can't remember anything. I was like, yeah, sure. I just don't want to come to work. Then I had my daughter, and the mistakes I made, the things I did was incredible. I'm honestly, I'm an overachiever, so I'm a little bit of a perfectionist, slightly OCD, so slightly obsessive about doing things right. I just could not think straight. So I really looked into that, and I think that the explanation is that once your baby is born, not us obviously, but our ancestors, all the focus had to be on the baby, right? You need to make sure this baby survives the wild, the tigers, lack of food, living in the savannah. And so your brain starts just getting rid of all this connection that it no longer needs. Like, you know how to tie your shoes now, so those synapses can go. You know how to ride a bike, those synapses can go. You'll never need high heels again in your life. The high heels neurons go. But you have to learn all these new skills. And so your brain, which is very plastic because the hormones are flowing in and out and coming back after nursing and whatnot, your brain regrows, but the connectivity is changed.
Mm-hmm.
And the connections between the medial temporal lobes, the emotional centers of the brain, and the prefrontal cortex, which is in charge of multitasking, of reasoning and performing, get even stronger. And I think this is wonderful. And we're not looking at whether having children is protective against Alzheimer's disease, because you get more estrogen exposure, right? Your progesterone balloons and your estrogens are all over the place. You get a ton of oxytocin, and those are good hormones for your brain. So we're looking into that now.
So that's why we really need, it's why we really need these longitudinal studies to follow long-term to begin. We can't answer it with our 3-year studies to know what's happening. There's another question. Does sleep have a role for postmenopausal women, and how does sleep interact with estrogen?
Well, yes. So we do know that there's a very strong link between the hormonal changes of menopause and sleep. And there are different ways to tackle this question. So first of all, the reason the sleep is so important and that we really want to protect it is that sleep is the only chance that our brain has to really protect itself and take care of itself, because the brain is always constantly active. Even when we're sleeping, sleep goes in cycles. We have the first stages where we're still kind of moving, we're not completely asleep, and then we fall asleep, but then we're dreaming. The brain is there. The brain has to coordinate all this activity, but then there's a stage that's called this deep sleep or slow wave sleep, where the body is completely still. You're not moving, and the brain can finally let go of you and be like, okay, me time. And during me time, there's a whole different system. It's called the glymphatic system that gets activated. And it's like a car wash. There's fluid that is really pumped inside the brain to wash all the impurity, all the toxins, even Alzheimer's plaques get removed during deep wave sleep, slow wave sleep. So it's effectively a clearance mechanism that can only be activated when we're asleep. And what happens for women at all ages, unfortunately, starting at age 30, is that their sleep gets disrupted. There are wonderful studies by the National Sleep Foundation showing that women have a hard time falling asleep and staying asleep. And fragmented sleep is really disruptive because you end up losing that cycle of sleep that is so beneficial to brain health. And that obviously is aggravated by menopause, because hormones like progesterone are really supportive of sleep, and hormones work all together. So when you lose your melatonin, when you start your sex hormones start changing, your melatonin might be disrupted, your cortisol goes up to the roof, and so that negatively impacts sleep. And also sleep apnea increases after menopause, and that's also really it's very hard for the brain. It impacts oxygen delivery to the brain, and of course negatively affects sleep. So we need to prioritize sleep, and I know that is so hard. Everybody has different strategies and different tricks, but we have to. Sleep and stress.
So how is your sleep these days with your grants and your 5-year-old and snow? How is your sleep?
Well, look, we've been in lockdown with no childcare for basically a year with full-time jobs, and my sleep has been a priority. I've been prioritizing. So the first part of the pandemic, we really had no help and 2 full-time jobs, and the little girl who was 4 and needed to do something. So I would wake up at 5 a.m. to work for 3 hours until 8 a.m. that I would wake up Lily, and then I have learned to prioritize sleep. So the fact that I'm up at 9 p.m., it's really to your credit that I really wanted to do this, because I usually am in bed with my eye mask, right? I go to sleep.
Well, we're grateful. I have great sleep. Yeah, I prioritize it too. So I have a question for you, and we just have a few more minutes. I want to ask you a big question to close, but I just want to remind people about the book. If people, and this isn't my final question, but if people wanted to be part of one of your studies, do they have to come see you, or is there anything you're doing that is remote?
Well, we do, the majority of evaluations are telemedicine, they're remote, but the brain scans are in person. So there has to be a little trip to New York, and we can do all the brain scans in one day. We really learned to work with people who come from out of town, but the brain scans need to be done in person, unless there's a collaboration in place.
Yes.
And perhaps they can be done with you at your center. Yes. I don't know. Right now, yes, they need to be with us at least one day. And
it's such important work.
But to be honest, a lot of people like to see me, like to see us. So it's good to come meet the team and just have a conversation. And
yeah,
I can't guarantee that it's always going to be me, but
that I think I would encourage everyone to help us understand this. So the last question I love, someone said, what do you think the future of women's brain health will look like in 10 years?
Oh, I love that. Well, I really hope that brain scans and brain health evaluations will be part of every woman's middle age appointments, the same way that we do pap tests every year, every 2 years now, the same way that we're encouraged to get mammograms, colonoscopies, the same exact way. I think our brains deserve the same kind of attention, exactly the same. So I really hope that we'll have all the information that we need to convince the FDA and the government that brain health prevention is valuable and is something that should be really incorporated in everybody's clinical workup, because our brains are our greatest asset. And if you don't make it part of the conversation, people just don't know about it. They do not sometimes believe it. They don't believe that there are things that are in their control that they can do to protect their brains. So I think that a brain health management strategy should really become commonplace, like an integral part of health. Of course, and I'm speaking to you. Of course.
You have just given our message, because, we say you are the architects of your own brain, and take it seriously, but start young. Don't wait till, always ride a boom after something happens, because everyone always waits till brain injury or menopause, things when you start to worry. But if we start building reserve early on, so I think we could have you every month and people eating out of your hand. I want to thank the Gratitude Fund again, Samara Klein and Andy, and the Container Store, who's been our sponsor for 20 years and helped us to spread the word on these. Don't get a copy of her book. Go right now, because I know you had lots of questions. I don't know that she has time with all of her grants running, and her 5-year-old and her husband, who's also a superstar. But also want to remind everyone, don't miss our lecture next week. Lisa, you may know him, Dr. David Katz, that does a lot on, weathering and thriving during this duress. If we can find out, one of the things that we push now is how do we help people in the worst time in our brain. Our brain capital is how we're going to make it through the pandemic, the economic crisis, and all the health. And we're just getting ready to publish a study showing, in fact, in the worst time, that people have regained part of their brain health index. But I suspect that all of you here are inspired and want to add years to your brain life. Tomorrow, you will get a survey. So all your positive comments that are coming up, pop. Please send us how we can make it better. We're here for you. If I'd made Lisa come, she would have been stuck in a snowstorm and we wouldn't have it. So the pandemic, she got to come. We got to have a lot more people. Lisa, you're just amazing. Remember, just to close out, so fill out the survey when you get it tomorrow and let us learn from you, please, please, please. Remember to sign up for the BrainHealthProject.org to learn, to start your journey today for a better brain, better life, better world. And we're going to add I'm going to convince Lisa, so help me. We'll do some big cheers for Dr. Lisa Mosconi to add some of the things that you're doing so it can be part of this longitudinal thing that's really going to transform the way that we look at our brain. Whatever gender we are, whatever gender we identify with, Lisa, I can hardly wait. You are a mind-blowing us all for all health. I couldn't be more grateful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to see you all. I'm so grateful for the invitation.
So go to bed, get your grants done, and we hope they get funded. We don't want to be part of your, people were asking about sleep aids. So I'll just close. Do you do any sleep aids? Just one more question.
Meditation. I got really into meditation, and it really helps. I do it with Lily, with my daughter as well. So she knows how to meditate. She can do the half lotus position, and she's so proud. So we do yoga, we meditate. Also, honestly, I have a little sleep spray that's been really helping. And maybe I'll share with you is certified organic from My Kind Organics is the brand. And they have a sleep spray that somehow really works for me. So occasionally.
Now we'll have to share it with everybody. So
Sure. It's on Amazon. It's cheap. It's nothing fancy, but it does work for me. So who knows?
Well, we can't wait to collaborate. And I'm just really grateful to you, Lisa. Thank you. This is the beginning of a long-term relationship.
I'm good.
Thank you.